Aloha and welcome to this screencast on the ics-play-bootstrap system. And the idea of this system is to show two things. One, how you can integrate Twitter Bootstrap with Play. And the next thing is how you can use a Git repository as a template, so you can stamp out different systems, starting with this one as a basis. But the main thing is kind of showing how Play and Bootstrap can work together. And as I thought about this screencast, I thought, well, maybe it's probably good for some of you who are just starting with Play to get a little review again of the basic flow of control in a Play application, because that's still, I don't know if that's still quite apparent to all of you. Here's what this application looks like. We've invoked activator run, and so that's set up the application on localhost 9000. And essentially all this consists of is two pages. So there's a home page with a little description that comes out there, and then there's a page one, which is a different page that you can get to from the nav bar. And all of this looks like your standard Bootstrap vanilla kind of user interface, which is what I'm trying to do, just kind of the minimum for this, so you're not distracted by lots of Chrome, as they say. Okay, so essentially what you want to think of at the very basics with any kind of web application framework is when someone types in this URL and presses return, what's the set of processing that occurs in order to return that value back? Or if I type in something like this, I get a different page. Okay, so how does that all work? And in Play, it's pretty simple at the top level. Basically what's going to happen is in this conf directory there's a routes file, and the routes file has this kind of magic format, and basically it says, well, when someone just types in the top level, localhost 9000 or whatever the domain name is, that's what this line says. What we're going to do is we're going to invoke the index method in the application class in the controllers package. And when someone tries to retrieve this URL, we're going to invoke this this method from this class in the controllers package. Okay, and that's all there is to it. And it can get super complicated with passing parameters and all that stuff. But right now we're just trying to crawl before we can walk, and walk before we can run. But really, we're just trying to crawl right now. Okay, so essentially what's going to happen in this particular application, we just want to, we either have one of these two URLs, and we're going to invoke one of these two methods. So let's go find those methods. To find them, we go into the app directory, then we go into the controllers directory, and in the controllers directory there's exactly one class which is doing all the controlling for our system. Again, a very simple application. And as you see, as we saw in the routes file, and in fact this has to be the case, there has to be two methods, one called index and one called page one, because that's what the routes file is in having the runtime environment invoke. And basically what these let's look at the index one first. What it's going to do is it's going to invoke the render method of a class called index, a Java class called index, and it's going to pass it a parameter which is a string. And then that object which is returned, the result of invoking that render method on that index class is going to actually be the page that's going to be returned. And in addition, we're going to we're going to use this particular syntax of calling this OK method, which basically provides the HTTP status code. So that's status 200, I think. OK. Similarly, for when the user invokes that page one URL, the routes file is going to the specification in the routes file is going to result in the runtime environment invoking this page one method in this application class in the controllers package, and we're going to call this render method of this page one Java class, pass it a string, and return the HTTP status code OK. Okay, so this is you've heard of the model view controller paradigm. This is in this application there's no model, there's no data actually being passed around, but there is a view and there's a controller. We're seeing the controller right here. Okay, the routes file is basically connecting the requests from the user to these particular methods in the controller, and the controller is now going to be invoking various views, because that's what these things turn out to be. And one way we know that is because they're in the package called views, app.views. And here is our index class. Okay, now it's not going to look at all like a Java index class. That's part of the magic of the way the Play framework works, is it's actually taking this HTML file, index.scala.html, and it's going to generate a Java class called index, and it's going to generate a method called render. And when that render method is called, it's going to kind of invoke this code, and this code is a template kind of language. Most web application frameworks have some kind of templating language. It can be written in Groovy, it can be written in a lot of things. In this case, the templating language is based on Scala, and what this is basically saying is that we're going to pass in a parameter called message. It's of string type, and we know what that message was because it was provided in the controller, and we're going to basically expand this template. Okay, so this template says I'm going to take the main template and I'm going to use that code and I'm going to pass it two things. One, I'm going to pass it a string. The next thing I'm going to do is pass it some basically arbitrary HTML that's going to be that's going to be passed in, and it turns out that that arbitrary HTML is going to contain the value of that message. Okay, so let's go look at our, well, let's first look at page one. You can see page one actually has the exact same format identically. We're going to be given a string. We're going to then invoke this main template with two arguments or two parameters. First a string called page one, and then a piece of HTML which is going to be passed also to that template. Okay, so the tricky thing is actually this main template, which is a lot bigger and more complicated. What you need to see here is that we do have two parameters. One is a page, the argument page, and the other is the content. And then what this template's going to actually do is pass these two parameters, or use them in returning this HTML, which is all here kind of laid out for you. And it's just going to substitute the content in kind of the body of this page, and then it's going to put the page name up here at the top. It's also going to use it down here to decide which of the menu items is going to be active. But the main idea is that the view that's returned is basically all of this boilerplate, which you've seen before. This is all boilerplate to have a Bootstrap user interface, where the page specific stuff is essentially just going in right there. Okay, and the syntax of how it accomplishes this, particularly when you look at that, it's going to look weird right now, but you're going to adapt to it and understand it over time. Okay, and so basically the Play runtime environment is going to transmogrify the combination of the main template with whatever the top level template, index or page one, produce the HTML and return it to the user right here. Okay, so that's the kind of the request response cycle. It's all you need to know. There's nothing really more happening in here besides that controller class and these particular views to do the processing. We also have some test classes, and I'll get to that in a few moments. But basically, that's how things work. So I'm hoping that kind of gets you going. So let's go back up to the README file and explain, now that hopefully you kind of understand how the processing works here. Second question is, well, why is this an interesting piece of Play code? And the reason why it's interesting, at least I think it's interesting, is because we started with the Play Java template and we made some changes to it. First, we eliminated a lot of the problems that existed in the Activator Play template program, which is returned, to conform to our coding standards. So this thing will pass check style, and files are named appropriately and so forth. And then the second thing is it shows how you can incorporate Twitter Bootstrap 3 into Play, and it provides a convenient way whenever you're starting to make simple web applications based upon the Play and Twitter Bootstrap. You can essentially create an empty GitHub repo, set this repo as the upstream of your repo, and then fetch it and merge, and all of a sudden you've got a new repo that's essentially initialized to the contents of this repo. And you can do that as many times as you want. That's kind of the benefit of this as opposed to just forking. Forking you can only do once. This process of setting an upstream master, you can do as many times as you want. So you can build 20 different, Bootstrap-based play applications, all starting with this one, and and every time it's going to start with all the check style passing and so forth. Okay. The final thing you want to do when you actually do this kind of template thing is when you merge it, it's going to be called ics-play-bootstrap. So you just edit the build.sbt file to change the name. Okay, so that's the first thing that it does. That's nice. It's all the check style stuff is gone. The second thing is that unlike the templates, the view files are in the default case lowercase, and that leads to the generated Java class name being lowercase, which is clearly not the way you want it to be. So I just went through, and in the view files, I capitalized all of them, and that's the standard for this class. And that means that when you are actually trying to invoke them, so if we go to the app, controllers, application, okay, so here we're invoking the view, and you can see where it makes sense, right? We've got to import views.html index. That's what you expect a Java class to look like, and that's just a standard Java class. It's implicitly generated by the runtime environment. We never wrote that thing. We wrote that little crazy index.scala.html, but nevertheless, what's generated is a Java class with the right kind of format or right kind of naming convention. Okay. The second thing we did is the standard play Java comes with a little main file, and we expanded that to support loading of Bootstrap. Okay, and this should look fairly familiar to you, but basically we're going to use Content Delivery Network to load Bootstrap 3.3.2. We will load a style sheet, okay, from the public style sheets directory. Okay, so that's the standard way you do that in Play, and that can provide our customizations to to the Bootstrap stuff, which we always want to do. We got these shim files to support Internet Explorer, and then we've got our standard responsive navbar. And one of the things that's kind of cool here is you notice that when we click on a page, we have the currently active page is the currently displayed page is highlighted. And the way that happens in here is we use a tiny little bit of Scala code to basically make the class active, or add the active class to whichever of these enumerated list items is actually being displayed at the current time. So we pass in that page parameter that turns out to either have to be home or page one. We check the value of the page, and then we set the class equal active when one of those is true. Okay, so that's a simple, super simple way of getting your navbar to actually reflect the current state. Then we have our content, which in the case here is just that simple string. And then at the bottom, we have the standard stuff at the bottom of loading jQuery and loading Bootstrap. Okay, so that's how the main.scala works, and we're loading Twitter Bootstrap 3. And then the controller, as we saw before, okay, we're just going to have two controller public static result methods, one called index, one called page one. It's just going to render the two files, so because there's two pages. And the routes file, as I went over before, we basically expanded that just with two, because we need to either to go to the index page or the page one page, depending upon what URL is requested from the user. The navbar, I just showed you that. And then, of course, very importantly, in our main.css file, because we're using that fixed top navbar in Twitter Bootstrap, we have to set the padding top to at least 50 pixels in the body to make sure that the content of the page is actually displayed starting below that navbar. Okay, so that's that part of things. And then finally there's some tests. Okay, so you'll just see a couple of easy ones here. This is using Fluent Lenium, and we're just checking to make sure when we retrieve the top level page that it contains the string home page, and then we go to page one and we make sure that that page contains the text page 1. Very simple. We'll get way better at our testing later on in the semester, don't worry. But again, for this process, I was trying to kind of minimize the code and just give you what you needed. So that's the way ics-play-bootstrap works. I hope you find it pretty easy. We'll have some exercises that enable you to kind of use this template to build some interesting stuff. And hopefully through that process, you'll get more and more comfortable with play.